All right. The Siyata D'Shmaya, Siman Peiches. What we'll try to do, I think this might be the only time for the year that we'll try to do one Siman in a day, two Sifim. This is a cheerful sugya compared to Maimid, in the sense that it's a beautiful sugya, it's Lamaisa, but it's a little bit easier than the sugyas that we've done before, but a beautiful sugya nevertheless. The Mishnah tells us, we have it in our booklet on Kuf Dalid on the Beis. The Mishnah tells us that we had a machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel in regards to chicken and milk, whether you're allowed to put them on the same table. The opinion of Beis Hillel is lo ola v'lo necha. You can't even put them on the same table. So this is our introduction from Mishnaic material to the Isra of Ha'alah, of putting meat and milk together. We could already jump in to the formulation in the Mechaber, and then we'll work backwards in terms of the Talmudic implications of it. Zok tehelig Mechaber Peches Aleph Afilu Basar Chaya v'Of, even Basar Chaya and Of Asa Alosa Al Shulchan She'ochalav Gvina. You're not allowed to put on the same table that you're eating with cheese. What's the Afilu Rabosai? The Afilu, of course, is that Chaya and Of is D'Rabbanan, and even though they're D'Rabbanan, so the halacha is you're not allowed to put them on the same table. Why? Chaver says shelo yavo la'achlam yachad, so that you shouldn't come to eat them together. Aval b'shulchan shesuder lavatavshul mutar litin zeh b'tzad zeh. That when it comes to a buffet, then the halacha would be that it would not be a problem. It's only the place that you're eating. So technically, a buffet of basar b'chalav would not be a problem. You would be allowed to set up a buffet, but when you come to sit down to eat, then you can't have them on the same table. Now, this halacha is hard to understand, and already the Rishonim discussed this. Actually, the first time I was Zocha to teach Isser V'Heter, Rav Miller made a big exception, which he's not into in general, and that is he allowed a few guys to learn Chulin in the morning. So we did call a Basar, and we did in the afternoon. So at that time, we spent a lot of time on the Shitas HaRishonim. There are many different ways that the Gemara and the Rishonim take apart this problem. And the problem being is that why would Chazal make a Gzeira when it comes to Basar of Bigvina if that is only going to be D'Rabbanan? Now, already the Gemara alludes to the possibility this could be a raya that Basar of Bigvina is an Isser D'Oraisa. We will see that the Placey will actually hammer this out, even in the language of the Rambam. Shortly, he will take the observation of the Gemara and put it into the language of the Poskei Halacha. But let's start with the way the Taz goes about this. Number one, we have Basar of B'chalav. Number two is there's another problem in this halacha, and that is shelo yavo la'achlam nachad, that you shouldn't come to eat them together. Rabosai, we don't teach this in kindergarten, but if you had if a person took a bite out of cheese and then took a bite out of meat and he ate them together, what would the halacha be? Would that be an Isser D'Oraisa? No, be an Isser D'Rabbanan. So we have D'Rabbanans on top of D'Rabbanans over here, that even if you're going to come to eat it, which is an Isser D'Rabbanan, then it's the Of B'chalav is Isser D'Rabbanan, and then if you eat it, that would be an Isser D'Rabbanan, even if it was beef. So it's a D'Rabbanan on top of D'Rabbanan on top of D'Rabbanan. Comes along the Taz in Sifkat and Alf is bothered by that. Va'af al pidik yishacham yachad nami lek Isser D'Oraisa, shein Isser el dafke derech bishul yachad v'nimtza v'gzeir l'gzeir b'gemara amrinan d'b'kahai gavna gazrinan gzeir l'gzeira. That this is an exception to the rule, that in this case we make a gzeira l'gzeira. So the question would be, why would this be a gzeira l'gzeira? And is there any other way to be masbir? So first of all, if you take a look at the Chachmas Adam tries to circumvent this problem without saying anything conceptual, but by adding words into the Shulchan Aruch that don't appear in the Shulchan Aruch. He writes in Chachmas Adam is in Mem Aleph Mem Yud Aleph, excuse me. Mem Yud Aleph. He says as follows. Kivan, the Basar v'chol muter kol echad v'echad b'fnei atzma v'adam ragel b'hem tamid chasheshu chacham shim yu shneim l'fanav yocham shneim yachad. Chazal were constantly afraid that you were going to come to eat them. V'lo od el shepam yatem yiseder hashulchan yistarach lalos hashulchan zeh basal zeh gvina v'niach hagvina ba'osel ilfis roseach shemunach ba'basar. So what the Chachmas Adam does is he adds something that we don't have in the Shulchan Aruch, and that is, he says, well, this chashash was that not only they were going to eat together, but rather they're bringing out, there's a word for it in these fancy American restaurants that I don't intend, but when they actually cook the stuff for you on the table, so we're worried that they're actually going to be yala l'ilfis, these things biyachad. So that's how the Chachmas Adam adds that this is not just a gzeira atu yavo la'achlam yachad, that somehow in theory this would bring to bishul basar b'chalav, but once you're going to have them on the same table, they're actually going to cook it in the same pan on the same table. That's what the Chachmas Adam adds. It's not the pashut pshat of the mechaber, and it doesn't solve the fact that the mechaber also said basar of b'chalav. But at the end of the day, it is important to note that the Chachmas Adam thought that there was this chashash. Why do we break the rules? We have a rule, ein gozrin gzeira l'gzeira. So why over here do we break the rules? So Miller gave two possible pshatim based on two classic approaches in ein gozrin gzeira l'gzeira. The first is the Rambam in the Pirush HaMishnayos in the halachos of hatmana. So hatmana, we learned last year, is going to be aser to be matmin in something efer cham. I'll read you the Lashon Rambam. V'asur atmana be'efer cham shema nishra bo gachelas ketana shel eish kishemazes es ha'efer yechat echalim u'lefichach nesur atmana b'shavs afilu b'davar she'ein mosif. So you can't be matmin b'davar hamosif hevel, because you might come to stoke it on Shabbos, right? You guys are following me in Hilchos Shabbos, right? So then the halacha is that not only can't you use coals on Shabbos, but you can't. So you have, if you will, two gzeras. You can't use a davar she'ein mosif hevel because you might come to use a davar mosif hevel. What's wrong with using a davar mosif hevel? What's wrong is shemiyatin. So it's a gzera l'gzera. So the Rambam asks this on himself, and the Rambam says that the answer to this question is da shezeh shamru ein gozim gzera gzera who could go and sheigzer bezin eza gzera bezes man v'yachzar achakach v'yigzer gzera gzera la'osa gzera zeh sheinosin avum hayu shtei gzeros beis achas mutter v'zeh shosin tamid. So this Rambam is a classic. It's very, very important to know. The Rambam is of the opinion that when we say ein gozim gzera l'gzera, that means that Chazal made one gzera, and then another bezin came along and they made another gzeira on top of that gzeira. So if when it came to Atmana, what happened once historically was that one bezdin had made a gzeira that you can't be matmin bedavar hamosif hevel because you might come to stoke. And then 200 years later, they saw that people were coming to stoke their coals. So then they said, not only can't you be matmin beremetz, but you also can't even be matmin anything. That would be a problem, gzera. But if at one period of time they instituted the same gzera, so then in such a case we don't have that rule. I think this Rambam is very important. I think it's the most classic way of explaining whenever you have the kashas of gozrin gzera l'zera. Yes.
But doesn't the Gemara in full in itself seem to be giving a different approach, like saying about comparing it to Chalas Chuslar, in Eretz Yisrael.
And therefore, it sounds like there are two gzeras over there?
Meaning, no, but it sounds like there's some, like it's saying like this gzera won't apply in this sort of case where there's a chashash to raisa.
You're talking about on the first Amud over there on Kol Basar. In other words, you think that it's not the pshat that it's really gzera, but it's not even gzera at all.
Or that certainly it's not just based on a technicality, but it's based on something intrinsic in the.
So the question is, what is that? What would that be? What's the Gemara doing by saying just because we're medam the chas chutzlaretz, what is unique to that dimion that removes it from gzera? All that's still vague in the Gemara. So this is the pshat according to the Rambam. Tosas in Brachos on Daf Nun Gimel Amid Aleph, Tosas has another rule that even in two different generations they could make gzera di'ilo ha lo kaimaha. That if the second gzera is there, because then the first gzera will not be kept. So then in such a case, what they're doing is just strengthening the first gzera. They're not making a new gzera. They're building off of the first gzera. Di'ilo ha lo kaimaha. In other words, that the first gzera, if you will, is basar b'chalav on the same table. But if we know that basar b'chalav is not going to be kept because of basar of b'chalav, so then it's going to be a problem. In contrast to, we made a gzera basar of b'chalav because we're afraid that people might not come to have basar b'chalav. Is it definite, or is it stam that the second gzera is just there in order to protect the first gzera? We were worried that people weren't keeping the first gzera, or we know that what's going to happen is that we don't make the second gzera, so then in such a case, then the first gzera is going to fall away and everything's going to fall away. Dilo hala kaimaha. Okay, so according to the Tosas, it could be that in this case as well, that just like Chazal understood that we made the gzera of basar b'chalav, in those days it was only a problem basar b'chalav, but eventually if we're going to allow basar of b'chalav, so then we know for sure that it's going to come lidei bishol basar b'chalav ba'atzmo, and therefore lo kaimaho, it's strengthening the first gezerah. So that takes care of the technicality on that front. The Placey, I photocopy this for you, it's towards the middle of your booklet. The Placey has a very sharp point. I think I could, let's see. Yeah, it's towards the beginning. The Placey on the first, in back of the Gemara, he points out as the following. He points out that what we had said from the Chachmas Adam, that the chashash is that you're going to come to cook, he points out that even though that makes a lot of sense, and that is a Lashon HaGemara, interestingly, the Shulchan Aruch is the language of the Rambam. In other words, what we had raised before, that the Chachmas Adam points out, that if the chashash is like you come to cook, so the Placey points out that that's what the Gemara on Kuf Daled Amud Beis seems to say. Yet the Rambam did not say that. So why did the Rambam not say that? So the Placey says very, very beautifully. He says, if you held that basar of b'chalav is d'oraisa, so then in such a case, if you held basar of b'chalav is d'oraisa, so then in such a case, then it would have made sense to say that you have a gzeira of putting on the ilfis, then it's going to be a gzeira atu a din d'oraisa. But the Rambam already paskins that basar of b'chalav is only Dirabanan. Rambam already passing the basar of b'chalav is only Dirabanan. So if the Rambam holds basar of b'chalav is Dirabanan, so then even if you're going to put it on a frying pan, it's going to be an Isser Dirabanan. So it's by definition a Gzera l'Gzera. Continues the place here. Avol fima de kaimlan ka'abayi de basar b'chalav v'of medirabanan umikol malkum gazrin Gzera l'Gzera in kainin tzarich loma de chashul ilfas rak pashat yochlenu yachad v'yavad Dirabanan mabikach aflis Dirabanan chashu v'gazru harchaka tfei. And you have to say that this is unique, that this here they made a gzeira for a far out harchaka. It could be this is part of what Yehuda Dov was mentioning in terms of being connected to Chalas Chutzlaretz. It might be a raya that in general we have a rule of ein gozer gzeira l'gzeira, but for some reason here we didn't follow those rules, and when it came to basar b'chalav, we created a harchaka tfeid. So probably the emes is you could fit it into the Rambam and in the Tosos. I'm pointing out that the Placey already points out that this whole gzeira is a very, very far out gzeira, and that's why we don't even bother to say that you might come to cook it, because the Rambam holds that even cooking it is only going to be the Rabban. So this whole thing is an added chumrah of harchaka. Stam, Ma'aser Rav, you should know that Rav Nevensal's son Rav Chizkiyahu told me that his father was noeg this way in his house, that he was always machmir to do everything he can, even though mi'ikr dedina it was mutter, to keep to an extreme, milchiks and fleishiks entirely separate. In other words, he would be makbid even if there was a milchik fork sitting on a fleishik a countertop to move the milchik fork to the milchik side, even though there's no halachic requirement at all to do that. So there seems to be in the tziltzul, the echoes over here of these halachos are this, especially according to the place he pointed out, is a general inyan laharchik, and I mentioned that might be connected to your point, that may be unique to dimyon, to chalas chutzlaretz, that somehow there's a general harchaka that goes beyond the general rules of ein gozering gzeira l'gzeira. Okay, again, it doesn't, the pashtus is, you say the Rambam's pshat or the Tosafos' pshat, but already once you have the formulation of the placey that this is a harchaka tfei, it could very well be that this is a general harchaka and not a din of one gzeira and then another gzeira on top of that, but a one big gzeira of harchaka. One big zera of harchaka. And then it could very well be that Yirei Shemayim will decide that he's going to have his own level of harchaka as well. Tov, so three different approaches and observations of what's unique in the language of the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam. Very good. Okay. The Shach in Sif Katan Beis points out that one could ask the question of why we don't have the Isser of Ha'alah when it comes to other Machalos Asuras. When it comes to other Machalos Asuras, we don't count this idea. And therefore, let's go to the bottom line. Bottom line is you're allowed to sit with a coworker who's eating bacon, and he's eating bacon across from you, and there's no problem of Halah b'shulchan echad. Yet we're going to learn in Sif Beis the problem of sitting and eating with your wife, basar b'chalav. Without you eating basar and she's eating chalav. So points out the Shach and Sif Katan Beis. We'll go through the Shach. V'nir dafka basar asal halas al shulchan she'achal chalav oipcha mishum deloy bedili in sheminei shekol echad heter b'fnei atzmo. It's because people are used to treating both meat and milk as heter, and therefore they might come to mix. But there is no problem eating on the same table and putting on the same table meat, kosher meat, and treif meat. Now, I would imagine that the CRC would not give a hashgacha in such a place that would put kosher meat on the same table as not kosher meat. I can't imagine they would give such a hashgacha. But mi'ikr dedina, there's again a different, there's the fifth chelik of Shulchan Aruch, and the mi'ikr dedina, there's no problem. There would be no problem to give hashgacha on such a thing. Miu, mimashikasav arash b'pirusha l'nedarim. Gabe Hamodar not continuing on the Shach Mechaver Ochlimo Ashulchan Vizel Shonov Lo Chashin Shemi Ochlimo Dekiman Shediro Mistama Sonim Zezeh. So the Shach now asks a kasha on himself. The Shach asks, but wait a second. The halacha is that when it comes to nedarim, if somebody took a neder that he's not going to be nene from someone, they're not allowed to eat at the same table. And there you equate it to basar and gvina. Wait a second. If we just got through saying that's only basar and gvina, you have this chash. So why is it when it comes to nedarim that when Ruvain is noder from Shimon, it's going to be a problem? V'yesh Lomar, skipping a line, says in the Shach, the nedarim kimin shein asar el mitzad nidro chashu k'basar v'chalav. So the Shach gives a good answer that when it comes to neder, so there it's like basar v'chalav. It's one of those things that at times is mutter and at times is asar. Just like chalav and basar, at most of the time it's mutter, so too this food is normally mutter, and even eating from this guy is normally mutter. It happens to be right now there's a neder that's at play. Avol b'shari surim yesh lama demoda rush. So he says, don't bring a raya from the rush. The rush asers when it comes to nedarim, because it could actually be that nedarim is going to be similar to basar b'chalav. Continuing weiter in the Shach. V'had dekasar rajba. The goy haboim chemtzo lebeis Yisrael asar loso imal shulchan pasuk kach b'shulchan aruch. So if our yisod was correct that it doesn't apply to those things except those things that at times are you eat together. Near the hasam mishum chomer the chametz shani kimun the chametz b'mashu rachuku shel yisar. So the first answer the Shach gives is that even chametz is also aser, but chametz is going to be aser because there's an iser mashu, and since there's an iser mashu, it's going to be aser. He then quotes the Orchos Chaim, who says, "Imrotza goy lechol chametz beis Yisrael mutter v'afil shulchan," but the Orchos Chaim is going to be mekel. So he says they could say dumi d'shnei achsanoim, that it's like two achsanoim. Umidihiter v'tayim dumi d'shnei achsanoim, dafka michlal d'svira dafil davar shu asur v'nei atzar asar lahalos imo ala shulchan. So you see that both the Orchos Chaim as well as the Psak and Shulchan Aruch is that you have to treat chametz as something you can't put on the same table. And the only reason a guy would be allowed to eat chametz with you on the same table is because the guy is considered an achsanai, which we're going to learn in Sif Beis, that you're two people who are sitting at a table in a hotel and don't know each other, they're not going to come to share. So what the Shach is doing right now is, again, he's asking on what he had said before. He had said before that it only applies to Basar B'chalav, and now he says that it does seem to apply to Chametz. And not only does it seem to be a chash of the kolshu, it seems to be that fundamentally it's going to be Asr. But the Shach says we don't pass in that way. V'gam nir li da Orchos Chaim model zeh el deshani hasam da ala lechem yichya adam v'ragel bal kol hashana v'lo bedili inish minei. Essentially, what the Shach does now is he just repeats the yisod that he had previously, and he said that just like people don't separate from basar and chalav, so too, since chametz is mutter most of the year, so then they're more likely to come to eat it. So therefore, you won't be able to put lechem on the same table as matzah. However, when it comes to nevela you never eat, and therefore you'd be allowed mi'ikar dedina to put it on the same table. The Shach then concludes a geshmak nafkamina. Ulefi zeh aser lahalos lechem shel iser ala shulchan kederach shasa basar b'chalav. But the nafkamina, based on the above, that if we're going to say that chametz is going to be aser because you're not used to separating yourself from it, so not only is chametz going to be aser, but also lechem aser is also going to be aser because you're not used to separating it, and particularly ala lechem yichya ha'adam. Particularly when it comes to lechem, we're going to be more machmir than other things. Yes?
Didn't the Shach, when it came to Chol Isha, he had a svara that Basar Behemoth's Mei is Nikar,
yes.
It's Tameh.
Right.
So,
but that might not be nevela.
Oh,
right. It was specifically in regards to, he spoke about that he spoke about the Chalav Behemoth's Mei was greenish, and so on, and he alluded to that it might look different, but nevela won't be because nevela is a kosher cow that wasn't slaughtered properly. Yeah.
So if you have one guy's, like the case we've been discussing is one guy has dairy, one guy has meat, so they can't eat at the same table.
Right.
But let's say one guy has kosher food and one guy has like basar b'chalav kosher food.
So would there be a chash? That's a nice question. That's a nice question. I'm sure the ink has been spilled on it. I just don't recall reading that ink. It's a nice question. In other words, what would you say? So if you're sitting across from, if you're sharing a table with someone's eating nevela, no problem. You should. But if you're sitting across the table from someone who's eating basar b'chalav together, since you're used to both of them being heter, would you say, or do you say that no? When is it that you're less likely to forget? When each one is, but when it's together, I don't know. I haven't seen it discussed. I gotta get back to you. Nice kasha. There must be someone discuss that.
Some of the basar is going to be not kosher.
That's true. 95% of the time, right? McDonald's is a nakud and a flaw, right? Because the basar is going to be not kosher, so it'll fall into the nakud and a flaw discussion, right? So it's not so l'maisa, but at the end of the day, it's a nice question that lahagdil Torah al dira should be asked. Okay, Siv Beis is the next step, which is a Gemara on Kuf Zayin Amud Beis. The Gemara on Kuf Zayin Amud Beis has another Mishnah. It's kedai to know these Mishnayos. So the Mishnah tells us, Sor Adam Basar Begvinim Mitpachas Achas Ulvachlo Yehu Nogin Zebezeh. The halacha is that you're allowed to store meat and cheese together in the same wrapping as long as they're not touching. So we'll have to discuss one day what the issue is once that they're touching. But being in the same mitpachat, in the same cloth, is not a problem. Shimon Gamliel says there are two guests sitting at a hotel, they could eat Basar and Gvina together. The Gemara already points out, to paraphrase the Gemara on the bottom of the Yamud, the Gemara points out that it's very interesting that Rashbag said Shnei Achsanon. He didn't say two people in general, but two guests in a hotel. So the Gemara points out that there's a distinction between Tfisa Achas and Shtei Tfisos. That when we're talking about that, when does a brisa say that it is aser? Says the Gemara 5 lines from the bottom of Kuv Zayin and Beis. V'lo asru ela betfisa achas. But if it's shtei tfisos, and that's the case of our Mishnah, it's going to be mutter. What exactly is tfisa achas? So Taisus there, Dibar Maskal Ke'ein, he gives us two pshatim. Taisus does it in an interesting way. He immediately jumps with a nafkamina. But we're going to do it the conceptual way. And that is, before we get to nafkamina, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah uses this term, tfisa, and the Gemara achas, and the Gemara in Bava Basra, Kuf Lamed Zayin Beis, also uses the term tfisa. The Gemara uses the term tfisa quite a few places, right? Tfisa, we also spent time in it last year in Bava Metzia. But these two times that tfisa is used, which mean entirely different things, might be relevant to our sugya. So the Rishonim are searching, how do we precisely define the word tfisa? So the Gemara in Bava Basra the Gemara, let's start with Avodah Zarah. That's what Tos starts with. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah talks about if you find rocks next to Avodah Zarah, and you're not sure, these were rocks that were used, there were some rocks there that were used in Avodah Zarah worship, and you have a pile of rocks of Avodah Zarah, and you have rocks around it. So says the Gemara like this: if those rocks are lying around next to the first pile of Avodah Zarah, so then in such a case you have to assume that those rocks are coming from Avodah Zarah. Then it's going to be tfisa achas. But if you have two piles, shtei tfisos, so then the first pile is from Avodah Zarah, that you knew was Avodah Zarah. The second one could be assumed to be a different pile. So tfisa achas and shtei tfisos means whether it looks like it's one thing together or separate things. Tosas points out, if that's what the tfisa achas means over here, that it looks like it's sitting together, then what we need to do is separate between the two. It can't appear that we're eating the basar and gvina together. So Tosas says, if that would be so, then a heker would be enough to be able to place between the two things. And once you do that, then you clearly have shtei tfisos. That's Tosas' first shot. Then Tosas quotes a Gemara in Bava Basra that uses the term tfisa a different way. Tfisa achas over there is talking about hotza achas, and that means, we're talking in Hilchos Yerusha, that we're talking about a family that eats from the same bank account, that is connected to the same Yerusha. That's tfisa achas. So the word tfisa could also mean an area that shared people are grabbing from. They're all grabbing from the same area. They're all taking out money from the same bank account. The tfisa is tfisa achas. In contrast to two people who are sitting across from each other, each one of them bought their meal from a different place. He bought it from McDonald's, and I bought it from Dougie's. So then in such a case, and he with his cash, mine with my cash. So therefore mine was from one tfisa, he bought it from a different tfisa. So it could very well be that the distinction is that when you have two people in the hotel, each one of them's coming from the north, one of them's coming from the south. So then in such a case, then that's shtei tfisos, and that's automatically going to be mutter. However, if you have two people, even if they put a heker, says Tosas, between them, but at the end of the day, it came from tfisa achas. What does that indicate? That indicates that we're much more likely to exchange. Because if we're all buying it from the same account, I'm being dorish time of the Tosas, if we're buying it from the same account, so then in such a case, it's much more likely that we're going to share with each other. In contrast, if each one is investing separately, so then it's less likely. So Tosas concludes in Dibar Asal Kein Tfisa Achas, U'lepir zeh lo ayri klal she'em mutar lechal al shulchan echad b'shvil hefsek shebein asayim. So Tosas says there wouldn't be any heter to eat with a heker. So that's the machlokes between the two explanations of Tosas of how to learn the Gemara. Interestingly, the Rambam makes no mention of heker whatsoever. The Rambam seems to paskin like the second day of Tosas. However, in Shulchan Aruch, we do have the leniency of a heker, and the Beis Yosef, you should do the Beis Yosef in Kufa and Gimel. There isn't a lot of Beis Yosef here. Beis Yosef in Kufa and Gimel says that it seems like the minhag is to follow the first pshat of Tosos, that we're going to define tfisa as a definition in Maseches Avodah Zarah, and not define tfisa as defined in Bava Basra to apply to our sugya, Kuf Zayin Amud Beis, and therefore heker will work. Yes?
Are these two answers with the same back and reasoning of Kirva, but they're just two different ways of not doing this?
I think so.
They have the same answer.
That's what I assumed. That's what I assumed. Yes. That's what I assumed. Says the Mechaber. Let's see how it's gepaskend in Shulchan Aruch. Hada asr lahaloisei ala shulchan dafke b'shnei b'nei adam hamekirim zeh. So the Shulchan Aruch starts out in the following way. He says the Isser of Allah is two people that know each other. Afil he makbidim zeh zeh. Now the Gemara asks an interesting question. The Gemara says, what happens if you have two brothers who would be tfisa achas, but they don't get along with each other? So the Gemara says, you're right. Really, we should say that it should be okay. But at the end of the day, people are going to get confused. So we'll assume afilu he makbidim zeh. In other words, people are going to see brothers that they're not makbid for this. They, or the brothers themselves, are going to think that they could come to be lenient in Basar b'Chalav. Aval achsanoim she'ein makirim zeh. But when you have guests that don't recognize each other, they don't know each other, mutter. Fa'afilu ha'makirim, and even if they know each other, masu shum heker, kigon shekol echad oichal al mapa shelo yafilu oichlam al mapa achas, v'noisnim beineim pas lahakira mutter. The halacha is that if they A, put a heker, we'll have to define some of the halachas of heker. B, or they place something, here the example the Mechaber gives is bread as a heker, so then that's going to be mutter. Before we talk about many examples, let's first see the Ramah. Says the Ramah, "V'dafke shein ochlim min hapas hamunach beinehem leheker." When we say that bread works, that's only if they're not eating from the bread. Aval mochlim imenu lo have heker de belav achi hapas sheochlim imenu munach ala shulchan. So if the pas is just there to eat from, so then wouldn't serve as a heker. Aval mnasnu beinehem kli sheshosim menu ubelav achi ein darka lios ala shulchan have heker. So, bottom line is that it wasn't common for bottles to appear on the table in the time of the Ramah. It seems like our drinking habits are very, very different. Chazal, I think, speak about drinking after the meal as opposed to drinking during the meal. So in those days, actually a kan would have been considered something abnormal on the table, which would not apply today. The Ramah continues, and certainly if you put those things that are normally not found on the table, like a lamp, that would serve as a heker as well. Let's talk about these things, these technical things. Yes?
Why would a piece of bread serve as a heker if it's normal to be on the table?
If they're not eating from it, then that would be enough to remind them. How?
It's a normal thing to have on the table. Why would they look at that and...
So the question is, how common was it for them to leave the bread on the table? And how common was that?
There wasn't to say, not for the heker. Like it's normal to have bread just sitting on the table, which is why if you eat from it, and it undoes the...
Right. I assumed that when they weren't eating from it, it was not so common to put the bread on the table. I don't know if that assumption is correct. That's what I assumed. Yeah.
Maybe if two people are sitting there, they have an understanding, like, this bread's a heker, we're not going to eat from it. So if they say we're not eating from this bread because we want this bread to be a heker,
that's enough. What happens if they put down meat and they say that this meat we're both not going to eat from, that's going to serve as a heker? In echanami.
It's not the actual thing.
Right.
If they're not sure that.
So I hear. I told you what I assumed, and the reason I didn't assume that way is because it doesn't only have to be a piece of bread; it could be meat. But all right, we'll have to. I want to get back to you on that question. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this menorah. So first of all, the Kreisi points out that, of course, in those days it must be that the menorah was not common for it to be on the table, which is a little bit different for those of us who think of candelabras. Often on Shabbos, many people do leave the candelabras on the table. In those days, they did not leave their lights on the table. It wasn't normal to have that, so therefore that would serve as a appropriate heker. The Kreisi adds that not only would it be appropriate heker, but even if you moved it from the place that it normally serves on the table. So let's say the menorah was at the end of the table and you move it in between you and the other person who's eating, so then in such a case that would be okay as well. That would also be acceptable. That's what the Kreisi writes. It's in your booklet. Now, there is an interesting comment that the Taz makes based on the Isser V'Heter, which also could be found in your Darchei Moshe. And that is, he points out that the two examples that we have over here are menorah and pas, and both of them are items that have height. They're not flat. So if you take a look at the last line in Taz Sifkat and Dalid, he says, Shetzarech tehei menorah gavoa k'tzas. That the menorah should have some type of height. It's interesting, we now have tea lights today. What would we say about tea lights? Tea lights, what was the height of menorah k'tzas in those days? But the point, of course, is that it should have some type of height in order that you have a heker that almost you can't slide your hand along and simply get to the cheese if you're eating the chicken or meat. So that's or not even slide your hand, or just raise your hand, I should say, and bring it across. There is an interesting question though about this. The Yad Yehuda raises one question, and Rav Wosner raised a different question. Take a look towards the back of your booklet. The Yad Yehuda in Os Aleph points out that that it could very well be that you could reject the Isser V'Heter Schumra because the Isser V'Heter doesn't allow something else. We learned in the Mechaber that there's a heter called the Mappa, and that is, what was the heter? Excuse me, in the Mechaber. We learned in the Mechaber the heter of Mappa. What's the heter of Mappa? Mappa is that if you have two placemats, then in such a case, the halacha is that could serve as a heker. So, the Isser V'Heter, interestingly, I'm going to come back to some halachos of Mappa, remind me to come back to some practical halachos of Mappa, but let's follow the line of thought of the Yad Yehuda over here. Interestingly, the Isser V'Heter doesn't hold to the heter of Mappa. So, the Yad Yehuda says like this. He says, Mappa is not a heker which has height. So just like Mappa is a heter that doesn't have height, so too, you should be able to allow a heker that doesn't have height as well. The Isser V'Heter doesn't allow a heker that doesn't have height because he doesn't allow Mappa. That's his argument. Now, the assumption over here is that you're looking at Mappa as similar to heker. That's what the Yad Yehuda is assuming. We could be miyashe for halacha and say the following. Say the heter of Mappa is that it's considered as if we're no longer eating on one table. Once we're on two mats, it's considered two separate tables. And the Yad Yehuda already says this. V'yesh lomar deshani hefsek Mappa desulu havi tfisa achas al davar acher meinu gavoa lo havi heker. So we have on the one hand the Mappa, which might be already considered as if you're eating on two separate tables, and the heker, which is standing up and is blocking. By the way, based on this, even though most poskim, the earlier poskim, when they speak about eating on two mats, it could very well be that you don't need to even be eating on two mats. If your wife is eating milchiks on a milchik table and you're eating fleishiks on a mat on top of the milchik table, that would probably be okay as well, because particularly based on the svara that we just said, is that they're considered two different things. Okay, it's not spelled out in the earlier sources, but l'chura that would be mistaber. Oh, that's one thing in regards to that's, and I think we spoke about what's necessary about the mappa and the issue of height. Now there is a fascinating piece from Rav Vosner. I find it fascinating towards the end of your booklet, and in Hilchos Nida. Of course, Rav Vosner's Hilchos Nida is a classic. Shirei Shevet Alevi and Kuf Tzadi Hey Siv Gimel. As many of you know, the halachos of Heker also apply to Hilchos Nida as well, and that is that in order to break chiba, then there's a requirement that when husband and wife are sitting and eating with each other, that there should be a Heker to remind that she is a Nida. When we learn Hilchos Nida, I like to say over Nevensal's creative Heker. Nevensal's creative Heker is as follows. He says, you could have a Heker actually that no one would know except you and your wife know that it's a Heker. So he gives a following example. You could have salt shakers that are appropriate for the table, but they're only salt shakers that you use when she's a Nida. So all it needs to be is between husband and wife. But generally, people will put something down that's not normal to be on the table. Like the menorah, that's not normal to be on the table. Oh, so Rav Vosner has the following kasha based on what we've just learned. He says that it goes back generations that a heker that was commonly used was a woman's ring. So he asks that there's no height to the ring. And didn't we learn that according to the Taz, understanding the Isser Heter, that a heker needs height? And we're going to see in a moment that the Gemara in Nida discusses the Gemara in Shabbos about a Nida on Daf Yud Gimel Amid Aleph talks about and equates the heker between Basar B'chalav and the heker for Nida. So Rav Vosner leaves off with a tzarachian that how could it be that the minhag became to put down a ring or anything for that matter that's not of height if we see that this Torah's chatas is machmir for it. The Taz brought it down. The Isser Heter is machmir for it, and he leaves off with a tzarach iyun. He writes, "Ach minhag ha'olam laniach afilu tabasuk dom machshim leheker imudavar nikol l'shneim v'chei mashma estimas haposkim." So Rav Vosner doesn't reject this custom between husband and wife. He just points out that it is a tzarach iyun why the Taz seems to be machmir, and yet the stimas haposkim when it comes to Hilchos Nida is to be mekel. Yeah.
Can we answer that by saying that Tosos tries to compare the case with the Gemara tries to compare the case of Nida and Basar Chalav, and the answer is that there's stay deos by Nida as opposed to Basar Chalav. So the answer why you might need height by Basar Chalav is
right. In other words, that you have when it comes to Hilchos Nida, we have a lower level requirement in general because of shtei deos. So I like what you're saying. I think I'm going to say something very, very similar at the end of this year for a different kasha. It is an interesting thing about using that also to answer. The question is, when do the poskim equate? When don't they equate? It's a little bit unclear. But yes, that you could suggest such a thing. Good. Okay. The Pischei Tshuva in Sifkatan Gimel now raises the following question. He quotes the Bach quoting the Marshal. He points out that it's not only a heker, but he says there are other ways to solve the problem of eating together. Halfway through Sifkat and Gimel in the Pischei Tshuva, to be Yoshvim Rechokim Zeh Mizeh, B'chtei Shein Yochel Echad Livshod Yodav V'Lechol, Mimasha Ochel Chavero, Shari L'Divrei Akol B'Lo Hekeira. So he says, if they're eating far enough away from each other that they can't reach the other person's food, then that would be enough. You don't need a heker. So it's not really so difficult to do this. I mean, it could be it's uncomfortable if you're having a conversation with somebody this so far away, but my arm over here reaches just the end of this table, but doesn't reach on this table. And whoever's sitting on that table, presumably, unless he has very long arms, won't reach to my table. So the bottom line is, it would seem to me, we could paskin that in the grus classroom, the halacha would be that there's no need to have a hecker if I'm sitting and eating out on this table and you're sitting and eating that table, then we could eat fleishiks and milchiks together. It shouldn't be a problem. Yes, Yosef Mordechai.
Does it depend on the width of the table?
Yeah. It depends on the reach. That's what it sounds like. The question is the reach. The fact that I can't reach and they could pass to me, kind of rather there isn't a chashash. As long as it's a distance already that I can't reach over and get the cheese when I'm eating meat, then that would be enough to be considered mutter. Yes, Mike.
Is it the same table, or is it even until even the same?
Very good. So we're going to get to that. Yefemod. The pashas, by the way, over here is that it's even on the same table. It happens to be that the way it works by us is if you and I would be sitting on the same table, I'd be able to reach your food. So that was just the example that came out. But l'chura, it would apply even the same table. But we shall return to that question. The Be'er Heitev, raises the following important observation in a parentheses, and the Darchei Tshuva that I photocopied for you in Sifkat and Yugimel. First of all, Darchei Tshuva, a little bit of you guys slowly introducing you to the different Svarim. The Darchei Tshuva, if you will, was the first Piskei Tshuvas. The Darchei Tshuva was a sefer that was written by, I believe, the son of the Munkacher Rebbe, that collected many Shilos Utshuvas Svarim. It was the first collection of Shilos Utshuvas. It's very funny, when we were learning in the yeshiva. My impression was that Rav Shechter knew the Darchei Tshuva very, very well, and I think that was like the Likut when Rav Shechter was learning. That was the Likut. It was Likutim and Basar b'chalav. Now, almost all the svarim that I've recommended that you use, almost all those svarim didn't exist about 40 years ago. It's fascinating. All these Likut svarim that people are using. The big deal was when the Badei Shulchan came out, but when my Rabbeim were learning Isra Heter, the Badei Shulchan also didn't exist. So Darchei Tshuva was someone who, someone was really, really holding when he knew all the Shulchan Aruch and the Pri Megadim and the Darchei Tshuvas. That was a very, very important collection. So the Darchei Tshuva, I'll show you, also makes the same point, but first on the page in your Shulchan Aruch, the Ber Heitev says, don't make a mistake. Afilu yachid sheyoshev al shulchan ve'ein imo shum adam afilu hachi asur mishum shema yavo la'achlam machmas shichecha. The Ber Heitev says as follows. He says that when you're sitting alone and no one else is with you, so then in such a case you also are going to have a problem of basar and chalav together. Rabbi Kiva Eger goes even a step further. That's pretty obvious. Rabbi Kiva Eger in Sifkat and Aleph goes a step further. Rabbi Kiva Eger says, "V'lo mahani lahamad etzvo shomer sheyashgiach alav." That Rabbi Kiva Eger says you can't have someone watching you, and that you're not going to come to eat basar b'chalav. In other words, the halacha is that not only when you have two people, even one person is going to have a problem, and Rabbi Kiva Eger says that a shomer is not going to work. This is where you get into that Gemara of Rabu Adeos, Shtei Deos, that if you have two people, they're more likely to remind each other. So Rabbi Kiva Eger says that a shomer is not going to work. Now the Darchei Tshuva, I photocopied for you towards the end of the booklet. The Darchei Tshuva, it's right before the Yad Yehuda. Darchei Tshuva points out that, what did the Lashon Mechaber say? Dafka b'shnei b'nei adam mekirim zeh. When you have two people that know each other, then we're afraid that they're going to come to share each other. Maybe, says the Darchei Tshuva, you would have made a mistake and be medayik from the Shulchan Aruch that if it's one person, it's always mutter. So he says, Hine Lashon zeh mashal chor d'ba'adam echad ein shom iser. Amnam, and then he begins to quote that many people hold, of course, that you have to be machmir by yourself. Hafuch, As Menachem Daniel pointed out, that when it comes to the Gemara in Nida, the Gemara says the fact that there's more people there is more likely to remind you not to come lidei Isser, even though the Gemara is talking about a slightly different case. But at the end of the day, it's more likely to remind you. And then he quotes that they found the Chuvas Marami Rutenberg that also says that halach would be that one person is going to be Asr, and even Rabbi Akiva Eiger pointed out, even a shomer is not going to be helpful. Rav Miller Shlita said that he thought that Rabbi Akiva Eiger, it's pasha to him, that Rabbi Akiva Eiger wasn't only talking about a shomer, but also a heker. That you're not allowed to create a heker for yourself, because the halacha of heker was heker combined with somebody else. But heker with you alone is going to be problematic. That's what Rav Miller assumed. And then Rabbosai, I found that Rav Miller was mechaven to hafla. It's a beferish hafla. If you take a look in the booklet, and this is the advantage of the Friedman Shulchan Aruch. The Friedman Shulchan Aruch is by far the best Shulchan Aruch. So they collect many achronim in the back, and the great hafla that we have in Ksubis, he says halfway through, I underlined it. It's on top. It says Yalkut Mefarshim. That's Yalkut Mefarshim in the Tafresh Samach Dalid. V'chein nira l'nias daiti beheter ashinu disiv beis ba'ina nami deos avalahalos al shulchan lo mahani shinui ulahachi lo nisker kan heter shinui. So Afla says that the reason why we don't have the case of one person with a shinui is because a shinui doesn't work. Rabbi Akiva Eiger already told us that shomer isn't going to work. So Rav Miller said on his own, he said that he thinks that just like a shomer wouldn't work, so too a heker wouldn't work. It turns out it's a beferish hafla. But Rav Nevensal disagreed. Rav Nevensal told me that he thought Rabbi Akiva Eiger was only talking about a shomer, and a heker would be okay. And sure enough, I found that the Chachmas Adam disagrees with the hafla. So take a look at the Chachmas Adam. Sometimes, it doesn't always come out that way, where everything you heard from your Rabbeim, you understand right away. Sometimes it takes 40 years. But in this case, it only took me a couple of years to find it. There are mamish things, Rabbosai, I heard from my Rabbeim, that I'm no longer very, very young. There are things that I heard from my Rabbeim I could think of that only 25 years later, when I was saying it, when I was preparing for a shir, and so I said, that's what he meant. Mamish, 25 years later. Ein adam yord l'sleif das rabbi ad achar boim shana. So the Chachmas Adam, towards halfway through towards Sif Yud Aleph, says v'kol shekain im ochel b'fnei atzmo o b'nei beiso shetzarech heker. He says certainly if you're eating not with yourself or with your b'nei bayis, you need a heker. Mashma what? Mashma that by yourself a heker would work. He's saying that at the end of the day you have to be careful that if you know the person that even if you're makbid, you need a heker. Certainly, if you're by yourself or you're b'nei bayis, you need a heker. What's a diuk? The Mashma the Chachmas Adam holds that the halacha would be that when Rabbi Akiva Eiger, if he wants to work with Rabbi Akiva Eiger, he was saying a shomer is not enough, but a heker would be enough. So Rav Miller just assumed, just based on Rabbi Akiva Eiger, he was just learning the daf in Shulchan Aruch. And it turns out that what he had assumed in Rabbi Akiva Eiger was correct according to Afla, and the Chachmas. And when I said over to Rav Nevensal, he didn't agree, and the Chachmas Adam seems to hold this way. But we're not finished. Rav Miller took this a step further. Yes.
There should be a machlokas and sort of mitzias of whether a heker would affect the single person.
There might be a geshmak alumdus here. I never cheshbon the lumdus on itself. We could discuss and say there. That's a good example of that. The goal in halacha seder is sometimes a little bit different than the goal in morning seder. If we would clear out every svara, then also we would never. But maybe we could cheshbon. Well, let's and seder would be my pleasure to try to work it through. So now we have the following. Rav Miller had the following shaila. What happens if you have a long table? So what did we learn? We learned where did we learn about the long table? We learned in the Pischei Tshuva about the long table, right? We learned in the Pischei Tshuva in Sifkat and Gimel that if you have a long table, so then in such a case, it's going to be mutter. So what was the case of the long table? Or that we had two tables that were next to each other that I wasn't able to reach in the Grus Kolel. So what did we say? We said that if you can't reach, it's going to be mutter. That's with two people. What happens if one person? What happens with one person? So Rabbi said this is a nafkamina. This comes up. Where does this come up? The truth is, I sort of didn't realize this. This is my Thursday night shaila. Almost every Thursday night I have the following problem. I sit down to prepare the Musar I'm starting Mir Tashem tonight, the Musar in the base of Medrash. So I sit down to prepare with supper from Torah Shraga's supper. And usually, this is the way I am, I usually don't end up finishing my last coffee. So I have my coffee sitting on my desk. Supper is generally fleishiks. It took me a while to realize that I just didn't even think of it, because the coffee's sitting over here in one corner of the desk. The coffee's long forgotten about. That was like coffee from preparing shir during lunchtime. So, and now it's supper time. So the coffee's long gone. It's not just a pain in the neck. Now you just have to get rid of the coffee that's left. But it's still drinkable. It's still a shaila of halah. So l'chura, it will be asr. It will be asr to eat supper on the same table with your coffee, right? Does that make sense? A coffee with milk. What happens if you have a Shulchan Aruch? In other words, often the coffee I already pushed it far away because I wasn't interested for a while. So it's not within my reach of the supper that I'm eating. So in such a case, would that be mutter or not? So now we saw that the halacha is that if I was eating supper, and my wife was drinking coffee, then for sure, if I can't reach the coffee, it's going to be mutter. But what about by myself? So Miller said he thought, based on his assumption, which he was learning like whom? Like the hafla, he said it would be totally in the chakira of how you look at a long table. Someone just said it before. Was it Mike? You said it? How do you look at a long table? Someone said that. How do you look at a long table? It was the other Mike who said it, or whoever it was who said it. How do you look at the long table? Do you look at the long table as a pshat, that it's considered as if it's two different makomos, like two different mappas? So then in such a case, the halacha would be that's mutter. But if you say that you look at a long table as a heker, we said that with one person, a heker is not going to work. That was Rav Miller's whole cheshbon, al pi shitaso, learning like the hafla. If you learn like the chachmas adam, so then a heker works even by a single individual as well. The Badei HaShulchan actually leaves this off as a suffix. In Dibra Maschel Asu, he's mesupik about this, about whether a long table is going to work for one person. So one of the things that sort of strikes us as we're learning these halachos is, ironically, with another person, you're more likely to have clearer heterim than you do when you're sitting by yourself. Okay, a few more points b'siyata d'shmaya. The Yad Avram points out in regards to the two mats. So he points out that the only way the heter of the mats is going to work, the Yad Avram, by the way, of course we have the Yad Yehuda, who is the posek of Tzadi Gur that we quote a lot. We point out his methodology was to go back to really be precise as possible in the Chachmei Ashkenaz. So the Yad Avram is a perush on the Shulchan Aruch that in most of the newer Shulchan Aruchs is in the Yalkut Mefarshim. He says that this heter that's going to work is when you have two mats is only if people generally don't share when they have two mats. But if it's common for people to share with two mats, then obviously the heter is not going to apply. It's only if nearly as daide farish to marish darkum lechol kol echad mipas shelo ma pat shelo v'lishtos mikli shelo shum hachi lo have heker elam kein shein ochlin klal mimenu di'ochel echad mehem mimenu lo have heker. So here he's talking about pas. I'm sorry. Here he's talking about bread. Avos, okay, and that's logical. Avos zeh ein darkum lechol kol echad al ma b'shelo. So he says, but if they do normally eat on two different mats, so then in such a case, that would not serve as a as a heker. Okay. Finally, wrapping up the Siman in the Ramah, we have two more points to do. One is the Ramah, and then we have to discuss the famous question about other people sitting with you and how that affects the halachos of heker. Because up until now, we've been assuming either you're sitting by yourself or you're sitting with one other person. What happens if there are other people sitting at the table? How will that affect the halacha? First, in regards to salt shakers, wrapping up the Siman, the Ramah says, "V'yu zihirim shelo lishtos mikli echad mishum shamaychal nidbak bekli." You have to be careful not to drink from the same cup. V'kol sheken shelo ochel mipas echad. Certainly, you shouldn't eat from the same piece of bread. V'chein nogin liyachi kli shel melach. You should have two different utensils, I'm using that word intentionally, for salt. And that because what happens is sometimes you dip into the salt, and there's shiurei maichal b'melach. Now there's some people who according to Rav Nebenzahl, misunderstood this halacha in the Shulchan Aruch, and in fact, Rabbi Forst has this in his Sefer, but I don't think he misunderstood the Shulchan Aruch. He has another concern. There are many people that think that you need two different salt shakers. You need a salt shaker for milchik, and you need a salt shaker for fleishiks. It would be erroneous, in Rav Nebenzahl's opinion, to point to this Ramah. The Ramah is not talking about our salt shakers. The Ramah is talking about the salt dippers. Many people, particularly Hasidim, use that. They don't use a salt shaker for the challah, but what they will do is they'll have a small thing with salt inside. And that was common in those days. In those days, they didn't have salt shakers, they would just have a receptacle that was holding the salt. So then the concern is that if you have a receptacle that's holding the salt, you dip in your Frankfurter, let's say, inside, and then you would dip in your pizza, so then you would have a problem that would come lidei Basar b'challah. But salt shakers are not going to have the problem. Now, interestingly, Rabbi Forst says you should have two separate salt shakers, but I don't think it's for this reason. His concern is a concern of Zeya, that we're going to learn in Mirz Hashem, things are going to get harder. We're going to learn the sugya of Zeya, and there we're going to have the discussion of that if somebody uses a salt shaker on top of soup, fleishiga soup, and there's real Zeya that goes up, so that can make the salt shaker fleishiks. And then if you're putting the salt into a lasagna, and there's Zeya that's coming up, so then that can make the salt shaker basar b'chalav, and then the next time you're using it, when you're using it for parva soup, then the Zeya is going to come, and it's going to fall back in, and so on. Now, Rabbi Kvod Rav Forst B'Mekom Munach, his sefer is fantastic. I don't think many of my rabbeim were really choshesh for that, because as we're going to see, for Zeya to really, really do its work, it has to get quite hot. Most of the times, it seems to me that when most people are sprinkling a little salt, usually it doesn't get that hot. So it would depend on how hot it's going to get and so on. But you should know Rabbi Forst says you need two separate salt shakers, but not for this. This sif is not the relevant sif. This sif would be that you would need two separate salt receptacles if you're dipping food inside. Okay. Yes?
That's what I'm not for not necessarily salt for the dip. If you use your dip to dip in fleishiks.
Absolutely. You should not use the same dips for milchiks and fleishiks if you're dipping directly inside. Yeah.
Based on this, Ramesh, you had like a cup for your cereal and milk in the morning. Should you have a different cup when you have like a meat lunch?
In other words, I drank milk in this cup.
No, you're drinking water.
Okay.
In a cup.
Oh, and then
when you have cereal and milk, and then when you have your salami sandwich at lunch, the cup is still on the table. Based on this, Ramesh,
I see what you're saying. I think the only chash is if there was really a Michael Hanidbak Bekli.
Like food that's in your mouth
that would be likely. It's a little bit unclear what type of food the Ramah was talking about, because usually we don't have, in our experience of drinking, the Michael is not Nidbak Bekli. What do they call it? Backwash, right? So backwash, maybe there is a little bit of a concern, but is there real mamashos in backwash? So if there's a chash of backwash, then I think one should be machmir. But stam Michael nidbek bekli. What are the? I think we need to examine what the likelihood was, and my guess is that in the Ramah's days things were much dirty, which were much more dirty. It could very well be that the Ramah is not even concerned about makwash, but the Ramah is concerned that the hands were full of milchiks and fleishiks, and it could very well be that was the concern. Remember, in those days they barely used any sekum, any cutlery, so could very well be that there is one person in this neighborhood who they say still doesn't use cutlery. And that's, may he be well, the big tzaddik, the Amshin of a Rebbe, that there's, in Chassidus, there is some type of idea that the Rebbe at a tish doesn't use, and he's supposedly very, very elegant about it. But, so, okay, that's Dvarim of Sod, etc., etc. But so for the Rebbe, then it'll be a problem. You see, so in a chanami, but nowadays, I suspect that was the concern of Michael and Nidbak Bekli, but we need to research that more. Yeah.
My question would be like a lot of people, like I think everyone I have one else, like they have these big bottles to force yourself to drink.
Right.
And like I guess if you have like say a burger or something.
Right.
For lunch, you'll use that same bottle of mac and cheese.
I think we're makel on it. The only if you're concerned that there was backwash, if you had a particular concern that there was backwash, so then in such a case, then I would recommend to be machmir. But otherwise, mi'ikr dedina, I don't think that one has to be machmir. Yeah.
Like after I use a cup, like a few hours later, if it's on the table, I could tell, like on the lip of the cup, like you could see that someone drank from it.
Drinking is not. I don't think that's. I don't think that's mamashas. Yep. Pischei Tshuva in Dalid says the following. He quotes a Masas Binyamin. Where it's halfway through Dalid. Va'ayim b'tshuvas Masas Binyamin be'emtza tshuva demashma sham. De'im gam achirim ochlan al shulchan zeh mutter af below heker. Dezeh odif mi'im asu shum heker ayin sham. So Masas Binyamin has the following heter. The Masas Binyamin says that you don't need to put down a heker when you have other people at the table. That once you have other people there, so then it's considered a heker. However, the Chachmas Adam I pointed out in Mem Yud Aleph is not mashma that way. The Chachmas Adam is mashma that you always need a heker, even if other people are there. I'll just give you a couple of references to Hilchos Nida that I thought that the approach of the Birchei Yosef in Hilchos Nida over there in Kuf Tzadi Hey, which is also mashma from the Torah's Habayis, and Rav Miller developed this in his Shiurim in Hilchos Nida, that there's a difference between whether there are people at the table or people that are sitting in between you and the Nida, or you and the person who's eating chalav. So there are some people who are makel that the moment in which there are other people at the table, then there's no need for a heker in general. That's one shita. This comes up, husband and wife are guests by somebody, and they're sitting next to each other. Is that enough to remove the problem of heker? So the mashmosa, I think, of the Torah's Habayis and the Birkei Yosef's psak in Hilchos Nida is the only time they would not need a heker is if they're no longer sitting next to each other. Or you could say, as Menachem Daniel pointed out, the Gemara in Shabbos on Yud Gimel said that the moment in which you have more people there, they're less likely to come to chiba. There in the Gemara it's saying that they could even remind each other. Certainly when there are other people around, then they're less likely to come lichiba, and therefore that would be enough. So there are 2 days. Mirz Hashem, one day you could talk with the guys who are learning Hilchos Nida now. One day we'll learn Hilchos Nida together, and we'll go into that Torah's Habayis more. But you should know, for our purposes, coming back to Basar B'chalav, that the Masas Binyamin says that it's mutter. Now, there's a flag on the play, as the Badei HaShulchan points out, because this Masas Binyamin is not written on Hilchos Basar B'chalav. This tshuva was actually talking about Hilchos Nida. And the Pischei Tshuva assumed that you could move over the halachos of Hilchos Nida to the halachos of Basar B'chalav. And again, I'm pointing out, even in Hilchos Nida, the halacha would be that there is a debate whether it's enough that there are people there, or you need people sitting in between you and the person that's eating the chalav. So these are open questions. Finally, the Badei HaShulchan in Dibar Maskele Im Asu comes along, and he questions the whole Masas Binyamin altogether. Then he makes the point that I just made to you about that he was talking about Hilchos Nida, and or he questions the whole Pischei Tshuva altogether. If you take a look, Dibar Maskele Asu Sham, page Mem Vav in the Badei HaShulchan, he says, "V'yanti sham b'tshuva v'lo re'isi hamashmal sham l'din zeh rak gabe isur de lo yochel nishto nida mevur sham de mutter kishacherim ochlen aval chora ein misham raya lo hadidan de hasam shari mishum de leka kira v'chiba beineim kishacherim ochlen gam kemi mohem." He says maybe in Hilchos Nida it's going to be mutter because the moment in which there are other people at the table, they're not going to come lidei chiba, but to share, in other words, they're not going to do chiba with other people at the table, but to share food, that they might be more likely to do. So says the Badei HaShulchan, he thinks there's a real flag on the whole play over here that it should be mutter. I think the Badei HaShulchan's ha'ara is fantastic, but I do want to point out what Menachem Daniel pointed out in the other context, and that is from the Gemara that we saw on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. The Gemara seemed to take into account that also when it comes to Basar B'chalav, that Deos are going to affect how much a person is likely to come Lidei Iser. V'haraya, we said that a heker, according to many poskim, is not going to work by one person. But if there's two people there, it will work. What's the magic? The answer is that once there are more people there, you're less likely to come lidei iser. So I want to defend the Badei HaShulchan's point is fantastic, but I do want to defend the Pischei Tshuva. It's not ridiculous what he's saying, because there is room to say that just like when it comes to Hilchos Nida, that more people there prevent the husband and wife to be nichshal, so too we know that when more people are there, they're more likely to remind each other from coming lidei iser. And remember, the people are also, there are other people there that could remind you, not just you. The question is, do we say that just like when people are there, they will discourage the husband and wife for being nichshal and nida, so too more people there will remind us from becoming lidei iser. So the Badei HaShulchan is right that it's not the same thing, but first of all, there is some dimyon in the Gemara Shabbos Yun Gibel Amud Aleph, Yesh Ladun, how far it goes. Number one. Number two is that it could be, once you have Rabu Adeos, we already seen in Basar B'chalav that Rabu Adeos is helpful. Maybe that's what he's saying. He was saying as a mashal ba'alma, that we see that more people help for Nida, so too more people will help for Iser Veheter. Okay. Adkan, and we'll pick up Emir Hashem, I guess, Asaris Mei Tshuva. That means that we should wish each other that it should be Ksivach Simat Tova, Shnas Chaim Tovim V'Shalom, and the year of Bracha and Atzlacha. And may we continue to grow together, and may we be zocha to grow in an environment where we see in Eretz Yisrael Shalom, and halavai to be zocha that we should see this year bebias Mashiach Tzidkenu b'yachad be'ezras Hashem.